The interview room in the Albright mansion was as cold as the rest of the house. The wide windows allowed natural light to pour in, but the absence of color and the rigid furniture made the space feel more like a corporate boardroom than the heart of a home. Richard Albright sat in a black leather chair, his hands folded on the table as he reviewed Claire Bennett's resume. He read carefully, but the slight furrow of his brows signaled distrust. "So, Claire," he began, finally lifting his eyes to the woman in front of him. "Your resume is unusual. You have experience with children in extreme situations, but it seems you prefer working outside conventional methods." Claire nodded, her gaze steady. She was a woman in her early 30s, with slightly wavy brown hair and a calm but assertive presence. "That's true, Mr. Albright. I believe that children who have experienced trauma need approaches that respect their timing, not ours. My role isn't to force them but to create a space where they can begin to trust again." "And what does that mean, exactly?" he asked, his tone hovering between curiosity and skepticism. "It means that I won't invade Holly's space," Claire replied calmly. "I'll start slowly, observing and allowing her to tell me, in her own way, what she needs. I don't work miracles, Mr. Albright. But I know my approach works." Richard leaned back in his chair, evaluating her answer. He had every reason to be cautious. Since the death of his wife, Emily, 2 years earlier, Holly had completely withdrawn. The 8-year-old girl, who had once been a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, now lived in isolation, barely leaving her room. Every attempt at help, nannies, therapists, private tutors, ended in frustration. Holly refused to interact, and Richard, lost in his own grief, didn't know how to reach her. "My daughter lost her mother," he finally said, his voice softer. "Emily was the heart of this house. Holly was her shadow, always following her footsteps. When Emily died, it was as if the light went out for both of us." Claire listened in silence, her eyes softening. She didn't need to ask how Emily had died, the file she had researched before the interview had provided the details. Emily Albright had died in a car accident on a rainy night, returning from a work trip. Holly had been in the back seat but, miraculously, had emerged physically unscathed. The emotional trauma, however, was profound. Since that night, the girl had not mentioned her mother and rarely spoke to her father. "Mr. Albright," Claire began gently, "what happened to Holly isn't something she can overcome on her own. But the help she needs goes beyond words and therapy sessions. She needs time and, above all, actions that show her that the world is still a safe place for her." Richard pressed his lips together, thoughtful. He wasn't sure he was ready to open his home and his daughter to yet another stranger, but something about Claire's presence disarmed him. There was a calm certainty in her voice, as if she knew exactly what to do, even if he didn't. "You've got the job," he said after a long silence. "But let me make one thing clear, I don't tolerate failure. Holly is all I have left." Claire nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. "I understand. And I'll do my best." When Claire arrived at the Albright mansion the next day, she was greeted by the house butler, who guided her through the hallways to the main room. As she climbed the wide staircase, she noticed the details, the absolute silence, the walls adorned with cold and impersonal landscape paintings, and the echo of her own footsteps. It was like entering a mausoleum. Richard appeared at the top of the stairs, impeccably dressed in a suit. He greeted her with a brief nod and led her to Holly's room. Before opening the door, he paused, hesitant. "She might not want to see you," he said, almost in a whisper. "I know," Claire replied. "And that's okay." When the door opened, Claire saw Holly for the first time. The girl was sitting in the corner of the room, surrounded by blankets and holding a book. Her light brown hair was tied in a messy bun, and her intense green eyes barely lifted to acknowledge Claire's presence. Claire didn't try to force interaction. Instead, she placed a small box on the dresser near the door and turned to leave. Before closing the door, she looked at Richard. "Leave this to me." In the days that followed, Claire began implementing her method. She left simple notes for Holly, short messages like, "I read about your book. What's your favorite part?" or "You're very brave." Gradually, Holly started responding, first with scribbles on the notes, then with short sentences. One afternoon, Claire brought a set of dolls and arranged them into an elaborate scene on the rug. She created a playful scenario that seemed unpretentious but was filled with small messages for Holly. When she returned later, she found the dolls had been rearranged, a sign that Holly had interacted with them. Outside the room, Richard watched from a distance. He was still skeptical of Claire's methods, but something began to shift. He saw his daughter sitting on the floor, touching the dolls, and even smiling briefly, something he hadn't seen since Emily's death. Richard felt a pang in his chest. It wasn't just Holly's progress that moved him but also the realization that Claire seemed to be achieving something he couldn't. He stepped away from the door, unable to muster the courage to go inside, and returned to his office, where the mansion's silence continued to echo. Holly's room had always been her refuge, a space where she hid from the world. However, in the days that followed Claire's arrival, something began to change. Small objects started to appear in unexpected places, a doll sitting beside a previously closed book, a set of blocks arranged in a pattern Holly had never seen before. It was almost as if someone were playing with her without being there. Claire observed these signs carefully, adjusting her actions based on the girl's responses. Holly still didn't speak directly, but she began responding to Claire's notes with simple drawings. One day, Claire left a note, "If you could visit anywhere, where would it be?" When she returned to the room later, she found an illustration of a large, brightly colored carousel. From that point on, Claire began creating a small playful world for Holly. Using toys forgotten in the back of the closet, she crafted an improvised carousel with dolls, wooden horses, and colorful fabrics. When Holly saw the arrangement for the first time, she stopped in the middle of the room, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. Claire, watching through the crack in the door, smiled. She didn't enter but let Holly discover it on her own. Holly spent hours rearranging the dolls and creating stories around the carousel. It was almost as if she were playing with an invisible friend, someone who understood exactly what she needed. Every time Claire added something to the scene, a little letter addressed to one of the dolls, a new ornament for the carousel, Holly would respond with drawings or small changes to the arrangements. One afternoon, Claire placed a small chair next to the carousel with a simple note, "Can I play with you?" When she returned later, the chair had been moved closer to the carousel, and another doll was sitting in it. Claire interpreted this as a silent yes, a small step toward trust. Meanwhile, Richard continued observing from afar. He didn't fully understand what Claire was doing, but he couldn't ignore the changes in his daughter. Holly seemed less withdrawn, more engaged with her surroundings. He saw her spending more time out of bed, exploring her room and even the living room during a rare moment. That night, Richard decided to try something he hadn't done in a long time. He knocked on Holly's bedroom door. Upon hearing the faint comment from his daughter, he slowly opened the door. She was sitting on the floor, rearranging the dolls around the improvised carousel. Richard noticed how animated she seemed, her eyes shining in a way he hadn't seen since Emily's death. "You're busy in here," he said, with a shy smile. Holly looked at him, surprised, but didn't pull away as she usually did. "I'm playing," she replied, her voice low but no longer distant. Richard approached, sitting beside her on the floor. He looked at the carousel and the dolls, trying to understand the meaning behind the elaborate scene. "Who set this up?" Holly hesitated, fidgeting with one of the dolls. "Me and someone." Richard frowned. "Someone?" Holly didn't respond directly. Instead, she picked up one of the dolls and placed it on a carousel horse. "She helps me. She doesn't talk to me, but she understands what I want." Richard observed his daughter for a few seconds, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't describe. It was strange to think that someone from outside was managing to reach Holly in a way he couldn't. But at the same time, seeing his daughter so animated comforted him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. "You're having fun, aren't you?" he asked. Holly nodded, looking at her father with a shy but genuine smile. "It's fun." Richard felt a wave of relief. Even though he still didn't fully understand Claire's methods, it was impossible to deny that something was working. For the first time in years, he saw a glimpse of the Holly he thought he had lost forever. Richard continued watching Holly as she rearranged the dolls on the improvised carousel. The scene was, at once, both strange and comforting. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her so engrossed in something, so absorbed in her own imagination. "She helps me," Holly repeated as she placed another doll in position. Her tone was light, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Richard tilted his head, trying to understand. "Are you talking about Claire? The nanny?" Holly paused for a moment, her fingers still holding the doll. Her eyes met Richard's, filled with curiosity and a hint of confusion. "Who's Claire?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He blinked, surprised, and tried to stay calm. "Claire is the woman who's here to help you. She arrived yesterday. Haven't you seen her?" Holly shook her head. "There's no one here." Richard remained silent, watching his daughter as she went back to rearranging the carousel as if nothing had happened. His mind, however, was in turmoil. How could Holly not know who Claire was? Was Claire neglecting her work and simply creating these scenarios without ever directly interacting with Holly? Or was she just avoiding her responsibility altogether? "Are you sure you haven't seen anyone?" he pressed, trying to keep his voice casual. Holly, without looking up, replied simply, "I'm sure. It's just me and my friend." Richard felt a growing unease. He stood up, gave Holly a light pat on the shoulder, and murmured, "Good night, dear." As he left the room, his thoughts were a whirlwind of doubts and distrust. Back in his office, Richard shut the door and sat in his leather chair. He thought about the interview with Claire, about how she had spoken of her slow and respectful approach. Maybe that was it, she simply didn't want to force her presence on Holly. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that Holly didn't even know who Claire was. His mind began spinning alternative scenarios. What if Claire was merely creating distractions for Holly while keeping her distance? What if she wasn't fulfilling her responsibilities at all? Richard couldn't dismiss these possibilities. He had already failed to protect Holly once, by burying himself in work and leaving her to cope with her grief alone, and he wouldn't let it happen again. "I need to know what's going on," he murmured to himself. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He contacted the security company that had installed the alarm systems in the mansion and requested discrete cameras be added to Holly's room, the living room, and some common areas of the house. He justified the request as a security measure to monitor Holly, but in truth, he wanted to keep an eye on Claire. As the technicians installed the cameras, Richard felt a mix of guilt and determination. He wasn't a man to trust blindly, especially when it came to his daughter. He needed proof that Claire was doing her job properly, or not. Richard was sitting in his office, watching the security interface on the monitor in front of him. The cameras he had installed captured images of various parts of the house, but his main focus was Holly's room. He watched attentively, his face a mixture of anxiety and determination. When the recording began, Richard saw Claire entering Holly's room with light steps. She carried a box of toys and colorful papers. Holly wasn't there, which made it clear that Claire did her work when the girl was elsewhere. He watched as Claire organized the toys on the improvised carousel and placed handwritten notes in strategic spots around the room. In one of the videos, Claire sat on the floor beside the carousel, looking thoughtful. She did nothing but gaze at the space around her, as if trying to absorb the energy of the room. At one point, she slightly moved a doll to the center of the carousel, as if she knew exactly where Holly would place it. Richard paused the video, feeling a wave of confusion. Claire didn't interact directly with Holly but seemed to understand the girl in a way he couldn't. Her behavior was methodical, almost ritualistic. Something about her gestures made him wonder if it truly worked or if it was just a matter of luck. Later that same day, Richard decided to observe Holly without her knowledge. He watched her enter the room and stop in her tracks. His daughter stood silently, staring at the changes Claire had made. He observed as Holly approached the carousel, gently touching the dolls. She began rearranging the pieces, almost as if she were answering a silent message. Holly then picked up one of the notes Claire had left and read it aloud, although quietly. "Which doll do you think would win a race?" She smiled to herself before picking one of the dolls and placing it at the front of the carousel. Richard watched everything, his feelings split between relief and perplexity. Holly was engaging, responding, but everything seemed so indirect. He didn't know if it was a sign of progress or proof that Claire was simply avoiding direct confrontation with his daughter. That night, as he reviewed the recordings, Richard decided he needed answers. The next day, he called Claire in for a conversation. They met in the living room, where Claire was organizing a set of children's books she had brought for Holly. "Claire," Richard began, his voice firm but controlled. "I want to understand exactly what you're doing." Claire stood and turned toward him, showing no signs of surprise. "Of course. Ask whatever you want." "I installed cameras," he admitted, hoping the confession would unsettle her. "I wanted to see how you were handling Holly. And what I saw was different. You never talked to her directly. In fact, she doesn't even know you're here." Claire crossed her arms, meeting his gaze without any discomfort. "I'm not surprised. I suspected you might do that. And you're right, I don't talk to Holly directly. Not yet." "Why not?" Richard asked, his voice hardening. "You're her nanny. Why are you hiding? Why does she think you don't exist?" Claire sighed, her tone calm. "Holly isn't ready to trust me, Mr. Albright. If I appear and try to fill the space her mother left, it will only push her further away. She needs time to open up on her own, without feeling pressured." Richard frowned. "And what makes you think this method will work?" "Because it's worked before," Claire said, her voice gaining weight. "I lost my daughter a few years ago. She suffered from a condition similar to Holly's, trapped in a world that seemed to have no way out. And I know, painfully, what happens when you try to force someone to leave that space before they're ready." Richard fell silent, processing her words. It was the first time Claire had mentioned anything personal. He felt the weight in her tone, as if it carried a truth he couldn't ignore. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Claire continued. "I'm just trying to show Holly that it's safe to explore her world again. When she's ready, I'll be there. Not before." Richard looked away, thinking about the last time he had tried to connect with Holly and failed miserably. Perhaps there was something in Claire's approach that he didn't understand, but that seemed to reach his daughter in a way he couldn't. "All right," he finally said. "But I want results, Claire. I can't afford to fail Holly again." Claire nodded, understanding the gravity of his demand. "Neither can I, Mr. Albright. Neither can I." The Albright mansion was starting to feel like a different place. The oppressive silence still hung over the vast rooms, but small changes indicated that something new was happening. Holly now left her room more frequently, exploring hallways she had previously avoided. Sometimes, Richard saw her walking through the living room and stopping in front of a vase of flowers Claire had placed there, with a note attached. Holly would read the message, smile discreetly, and move on, as if she were mapping out an unknown but exciting territory. Claire continued to work behind the scenes, now with Richard's full cooperation. He had abandoned his initial skepticism, and although he still didn't fully understand her methods, he couldn't deny the results. Holly was changing. She played, smiled, and even asked short, direct questions, something that had seemed impossible just weeks before. One afternoon, Richard decided to follow Holly without her noticing. He saw her walking to the house's library, a space she never used. Upon entering, she found a setup created by Claire, a stack of children's books neatly arranged next to a comfortable cushion. There was a note written in Claire's careful handwriting. "What's your favorite story?" Holly picked up one of the books and began flipping through it. She murmured small phrases, laughing to herself at times. Richard, standing at the door, felt something warm inside him. It was the Holly he remembered, the curious girl Emily had always encouraged to explore the world. For the first time, Richard felt not just relief but genuine hope. Later that same day, Richard found Claire in the living room. She was finishing reorganizing a bookshelf when he walked in, hands in his pockets and a thoughtful expression on his face. "She went to the library today," he said, breaking the silence. Claire smiled, without looking away from her work. "That's a big step." "It's more than a step," Richard replied, sitting in a nearby armchair. "It's a leap." He remained silent for a few moments, watching Claire. Finally, he asked, "How do you know what she needs? How can you predict what will help her?" Claire stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. There was calm in her eyes, but also a weight Richard recognized. "Because I've been in her place," she said softly. "And in yours." Richard frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Claire pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. "I had a daughter. Lily. She was 7 years old when she died. She had a health condition that kept her isolated, like Holly. I tried everything to help her, doctors, therapists, even alternative methods. But nothing seemed to work. And then, when we were finally making progress, she got sick again. It was too fast for us to do anything." Richard saw Claire's expression change, the silent but persistent pain of someone who had lost everything. "After she died," Claire continued, "I withdrew from everything. I worked as a nurse for a while, but I couldn't bear being around children. Until I realized I could use what I learned with Lily to help other families. So, I started working with children who had experienced trauma, like Holly." Richard took a deep breath, absorbing her words. "It must have been hard, going back to that world." "It was," Claire admitted. "But I realized that what worked with Lily wasn't what the doctors said or conventional therapies. It was the time we spent together, the little things we did, like creating stories or setting up scenes with toys. When I saw what it did for her, I knew I could do the same for other children." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And do you see Lily and Holly?" Claire hesitated before responding. "Sometimes. But I know Holly is unique. She has her own journey, and my job isn't to replace anyone or anything. It's just to help Holly find her way back." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Richard felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he found himself sharing the same pain with another person. "I lost Emily in a car accident," he said, breaking the silence. "Holly was with her, in the back seat. I've never talked about it with Holly. I never knew how. I think she feels I'm distant because I couldn't deal with what happened either." Claire nodded, understanding. Sometimes, the silence between the people we love can be heavier than any words. "But you still have time, Richard. She's still here." Richard leaned back in his chair, feeling a new sense of determination. He knew Claire was right. Holly was still here, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time being the father she needed. Richard observed the mansion with new eyes. The vast, silent rooms, once a constant reminder of his loneliness and loss, now showed small signs of life: a doll strategically placed on a chair, a colorful note stuck to a vase, an unfinished puzzle left on the living room table. They were details that might go unnoticed by anyone else, but to him, they represented something much greater. Holly was beginning to reclaim the space. That morning, Richard postponed important commitments and spent more time at the mansion. He didn't have a specific plan, but he knew he wanted to be more present. Claire, as usual, was already busy setting up the next scene for Holly. He found her in the library, surrounded by children's books and small decorations that transformed the place into a cozy corner. "Good morning," he said, a bit hesitant. Claire looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Albright. I wasn't expecting to see you here so early." "Richard," he corrected, with a slight smile. "I think it's time I started understanding what you do." Claire studied his face for a moment before nodding. "All right, Richard. Let's start." She explained how she chose the objects and placed them to create an environment that would attract Holly. "The trick," she said, while putting a star-shaped bookmark inside one of the books, "is not to force anything. Children need to feel that they're discovering things on their own. It gives them a sense of control, something Holly lost after everything. Richard watched her attentively, absorbing every word. And how do you know what will catch her attention? Claire shrugged, smiling. Intuition. And lots of observation. Every response she gives, no matter how small, shows me the next step. He frowned, still struggling to fully understand. And if she doesn't respond? If this doesn't work? Then I try something different, Claire replied simply. But, Richard, she is responding. Maybe you don't notice it because you're looking for something big, but it's the small things that matter right now. Richard decided to test this idea. Later that day, he went to the living room, where Claire had set up an adventure scene with maps, toy coins, and a treasure chest. He stood looking at the setup for a moment before picking up one of the colorful notes Claire had left on the table. "Can I write something?" he asked. Claire nodded, handing him a pen. "Of course. But write something that's yours." Richard stood still for a moment, thinking about what to say. Finally, he wrote, "If you found a treasure, what would you want to be inside it?" He left the note next to the chest and left the room, feeling a mix of expectation and nervousness. Later, he observed from a distance as Holly entered the room and found the note. She read it silently, picked up one of the toy coins, and placed it inside the chest, as if it were her answer. As the days passed, Richard began to understand that Holly's playful world was more than just child's play. It was a language, a way to express herself without fear. He started participating more actively, helping Claire set up the scenes and even proposing his own ideas. One afternoon, he suggested creating a secret mission in the main hallway, with clues leading Holly to a small hidden prize. "You're getting the hang of this," Claire said with a smile. "I never imagined you setting up secret missions, Richard." He laughed, surprised at his own transformation. "Neither did I. But I think it's working." And it was. Holly began showing clearer signs of engagement. She asked questions, still short but direct, and explored parts of the mansion she had previously avoided. Richard saw her walking through the kitchen one morning, stopping to touch a vase Claire had decorated. In another moment, she appeared in his office to show him a drawing she had made, something he hadn't seen since she was very young. During a quiet evening, after Holly had gone to bed, Richard found Claire tidying up toys in the living room. He sat beside her, feeling the need to say something that had been on his mind. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice low. "You haven't just helped Holly, you've helped me realize that I was as lost as she was." Claire stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "You were never lost, Richard. You just needed a reminder." He remained silent for a moment before asking, "Do you miss her, Lily?" Claire took a deep breath, picking up one of the toys and holding it for a moment before answering. "Every day. But the pain isn't the same as it used to be. Now, it's like a memory. I carry it with me, but in a way that doesn't stop me from moving forward." Richard nodded, understanding. "I lost Emily in an accident. And for a long time, I thought working non-stop was the only way to deal with it. But now I see that all Holly needed was something I wasn't giving her, my time." Claire smiled, a small but meaningful smile. "And now you're giving it to her. That's what matters." The two sat in silence for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, full of mutual understanding. There was still much to be done, but they both knew they were on the right path. The library was silent, except for the soft sound of pages being turned. Holly was sitting on the rug, surrounded by books and colorful papers that Claire had carefully spread out. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the girl's face as she wrote something on a piece of paper. Richard and Claire watched from afar, hidden behind the slightly open door. It was a moment they had learned to respect. Holly, now more confident, was exploring the world at her own pace. Claire placed a hand on Richard's shoulder and whispered, "She's ready for something big." Richard nodded, though his heart was racing. He knew this progress was significant, but there was still so much to understand about what his daughter truly needed. Later, while tidying up the toys in the living room, Claire found a note Holly had left on the improvised carousel. It was something Holly rarely did. She usually responded to the notes but almost never initiated one. "You play so well with my dolls. Can I play with you too?" Claire felt her heart race as she read those simple yet profound words. It was an invitation, a clear sign that Holly was ready to take the next step. Claire held the note carefully and went to Richard's office, where he was reviewing some papers. "She wants to meet me," Claire said, handing him the note. Richard read the words attentively, his expression shifting from surprise to emotion. "She wrote this?" Claire nodded. "Yes. It's her moment. But we need to do this the right way." The next morning, Claire and Richard began carefully planning the meeting. It wouldn't be forced, it would be built around the world Holly had already created for herself. They decided that Claire would appear as part of a playful scenario, something Holly would recognize as safe and familiar. Claire set up a new scene in the garden, something they had never done before. Using dolls, toy carts, and small decorations, she created an outdoor tea party, with marked places for all the participants. Among the spots reserved for the dolls, there was a larger chair, slightly set apart. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked, watching as Claire finished arranging the setup. "I am," she replied, adjusting the position of a toy teacup. "But Holly needs to have control. She needs to feel that she's choosing this moment." When everything was ready, Richard brought Holly to the garden. She stopped upon seeing the scene, her eyes widening in surprise. She stood there for a moment, taking in the details. Finally, she took a step forward, approaching the improvised table. She found a note attached to the larger chair. "Would you like me to join your party?" Holly looked at the note and then at Richard, who stood at a respectful distance, observing. He smiled and gave her a small nod of encouragement. Holly, hesitant, placed the note on the table and sat down. She picked up one of the toy teacups and began serving the dolls, as if she were waiting for something. It was then that Claire stepped into the garden, moving slowly so as not to startle Holly. She stopped a few steps away, waiting for the girl's gaze. When Holly finally looked up, she stared at Claire in silence. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Claire knelt down to be at Holly's level and said, with a warm smile, "Can I play with you?" Holly hesitated for a moment, but then, as if something inside her had unlocked, she stood up from the chair and ran to Claire. Without saying a word, she hugged her tightly, wrapping her arms around Claire's neck. It was a hug full of emotion, carrying years of pain, longing, and hope. Claire, surprised, felt tears running down her face. It was the hug she had never been able to give her own daughter, but in that moment, it felt as if part of that pain was being healed. She returned the hug carefully, holding Holly as if the moment could break at any second. Richard, watching from afar, felt tears streaming down his own face. He knew that this hug wasn't just between Holly and Claire. It was also a symbol of what Holly needed, the presence of someone who understood her, who was there for her. Holly finally pulled away, looking at Claire with a shy but genuine smile. "You're good at playing," she said, before returning to the table and picking up her teacup. "You're better," Claire replied, quickly wiping her eyes before joining the girl at the table. The tea party went on for hours, but for Richard and Claire, that moment was already a milestone. When Holly finally returned to the house, exhausted but happy, Richard approached Claire in the garden. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but full of emotion. "For this. For everything." Claire looked at him, still smiling emotionally. "It wasn't just for her, Richard. It was for me too." The two stood in silence, gazing at the improvised tea table. There was still much to do, but at that moment, it seemed they were finally on the right path. The Albright mansion felt different. Not that its cold, imposing walls had changed, but what was happening inside them was new. The silence that had once echoed through the halls was now filled with laughter and quiet conversations. The change was almost tangible, as if the house, once a monument to emptiness, had found its soul. Richard descended the stairs, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. He had just finished a video call with a client, ending his workday early for something he now considered far more important. Passing through the living room, he saw Holly sitting on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils and drawings scattered around her. Claire sat beside her, helping her choose colors. "Dad, come see what I made," Holly called out, holding up a drawing for him. Richard walked over, smiling. It was a simple but meaningful portrait, a garden with 3 figures holding hands, himself, Holly, and Claire, all surrounded by flowers and a bright blue sky. He knelt beside his daughter to get a better look. "It's beautiful, Holly," he said sincerely. "You're very talented." Holly beamed with pride. "Claire said I should draw something that makes me happy." Richard glanced at Claire, who returned the smile with a calm, knowing look. He knew he could never fully express his gratitude, but moments like this spoke for themselves. Later, while Holly was busy playing with her dolls, Richard and Claire went to the kitchen, where he began preparing dinner. It was something Richard had recently learned, inspired by how Claire transformed small actions into meaningful moments. "You're getting the hang of it," Claire said, watching as he chopped vegetables. "Let's just say it's a work in progress," Richard replied with a laugh. They worked side by side, chatting about Holly's progress and plans for the future. Claire mentioned how Holly had started creating her own stories, incorporating the scenes they had built together. It was a clear sign that the girl was growing emotionally, finding her voice. "You did this for her," Richard said, pausing for a moment to look at Claire. "For us?" Claire shook her head modestly. She had all of this inside her. She just needed a nudge. "And you, well, you've become the father she always needed." Richard felt a lump in his throat but nodded. "I guess I'm learning." A few months later, the Albright mansion hosted a group of children for the first time. Holly, excited, had invited school friends for a small garden party. It was a simple event but marked a giant step forward. Richard watched from a distance as Holly played with her friends, laughing and leading the activities like a confident host. "She's happy," Claire said, standing beside him. "Yes, she is," Richard replied. He paused before adding, "And you're part of that, Claire. Not just for Holly. For me too." Claire smiled but said nothing. She knew she didn't need to. That evening, after the guests had left and Holly was asleep, Richard walked out to the garden. Claire was there, collecting the last of the toys. He stopped, watching her for a moment before approaching. "I never thought this place could feel like a home," he said, looking around. Claire smiled, holding a doll. "You made it a home, Richard." He looked at her, deeply grateful. "With your help." For a moment, they stood in silence, reflecting on everything they had overcome together. They weren't a conventional family, but they had built something real, something worth protecting. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.